February 14th, 1942. Mindoro Strait, Philippine Islands. The night is the kind that swallows shapes whole. No moon, no horizon, only the oily heave of black water and the faint, sickly glow of instrument dials leaking from a submarine's bridge hatch. Inside the boat, the air is warm and metallic, layered with diesel residue, sweat, and the sour tang of battery compartments. Red battle lanterns paint every face in bruised shadows. You can feel the hull flex faintly as it knifes through the swells, steel breathing like an animal trying not to be heard. Lieutenant Commander Halford Pierce, U.S. Navy, stands in the conning tower with one eye pressed to the periscope. He doesn't blink. He can't afford to. The periscope's eyepiece is cold against his brow, and the ocean beyond it looks like ink spilled across the world. Range, 3,000 yards. Target angle, steady. The voice comes from Lieutenant J.G. Frank Malloy, hunched over the TDC, torpedo data computer, hands moving in practiced tightness, as if rough motion could spook the numbers. Somewhere forward, in the torpedo room, Chief Torpedo Man's mate Miguel Santoro crouches near the tubes, listening to the boat the way a mechanic listens to an engine. He knows every creak, every unusual tremor. He knows the feeling in your teeth when fear is trying to become panic. Through the periscope, Pierce sees it at last. A Japanese merchant ship, fat-bellied and confident, plowing south with a lazy bow wave. Darkened, but not truly hidden. A smudge against the darker smudge of night, outlined by just enough starlight to look real. An escort destroyer rides off the starboard quarter like a watchdog, with its head half turned. Pierce's mouth is dry. His voice stays level anyway. Take her! Malloy's fingers twist dials, setting the solution with the calm of a man doing arithmetic, while a knife hovers over his throat. Solution set. Pierce watches the target's wake, watches the escort's pattern. The boat is at periscope depth, shallow enough that every surface ripple feels like it might carry a sound to the enemy. Men hold their breath without being told. Open outer doors, Pierce orders. Deep inside the hull, valves turn. Water floods around the torpedoes with a muffled, ominous rush. Santoro's world is cramped steel and condensation. Torpedoes lying in their racks like sleeping beasts, each one a long cylinder of promises and mathematics. These are Mark 14 torpedoes, the pride of peacetime engineering on paper. Each one carries a warhead meant to tear a ship's guts out. Each one wears a Mark 6 exploder, a mechanism designed to detonate beneath a target's keel with magnetic influence, or on impact if the magnetic feature fails. That's what the manual says. Pierce whispers into the periscope as if the ocean might overhear him. Fire one. Fire one, Malloy echoes. Santoro yanks the lever. The submarine shudders as the torpedo leaves the tube. An unmistakable kick, like the boat just exhaled a tooth. A faint whir follows, the torpedo's engine spinning up as it vanishes into darkness. Fire two, another kick, another silent departure. Fire three, kick, fire four, kick. 4 torpedoes racing through black water toward a ship that has no idea death is threading toward it. In the conning tower, the periscope view is everything. Pierce rides it like a tightrope. He watches the merchant's dark flank slide across the lens, counts in his head, measures the seconds by instinct more than training. A minute passes. 2. Then, there, a pale streak in the water, faintly visible, a torpedo's wake, arrowing in. Pierce's heart tightens. The first torpedo should strike under the forward hold. the second near the engine spaces, the third just aft, the fourth, insurance. He braces for the bloom of orange light, the heaving concussion, the sudden tilt of a ship dying. Instead, a dull, ugly thunk carries through the sea and into the submarine's bones. Not the crack of a detonation, not the violent concussion that would rattle valves and knock men into bulkheads. Just a hit, a contact, like a hammer against wood. No explosion. For half a second, Pierce thinks his senses are lying. Then he sees it. The merchant ship keeps moving. A second torpedo arrives. Another pale wake. Another impact. Thunk. Still no detonation. In the torpedo room, Santoro's jaw muscles bunch. He doesn't have the luxury of seeing it, but he knows the sound transmitted through the hull. Every experienced submariner does. A true hit is a punch. A true hit is a drumbeat of destruction. This is wrong. Up on the Japanese merchantman's bridge, a cluster of officers huddle behind a canvas windbreak, peering into the night. A young lieutenant, junior grade, in the Imperial Japanese Navy, assigned as liaison to the convoy, tilts his head as if listening to a distant door closing. He hears the impacts, too, feels them through the deck. For a heartbeat, his hand rises to signal alarm. Then nothing happens. No column of fire, no screaming steel, no catastrophic shudder. A grin spreads across his face, slow and disbelieving. He says something to the captain, short, mocking. A laugh follows, sharp in the wind. The bridge crew relaxes by inches. One sailor spits over the side. "American torpedoes," the lieutenant says again, and this time the contempt is open. Useless! On the submarine below, Pierce feels humiliation curdle into anger. It's a physical thing, hot behind the ribs. He watches the merchant ship continue on its course, untouched except for invisible bruises in its hull plating. The escort destroyer begins to turn. Not panicked, not frantic. Curious, like it smelled something odd and decided to investigate anyway. "Down periscope!" Pierce snaps. The periscope drops with a mechanical hiss. The conning tower becomes a sealed, red cave again. "Take her down. 100 feet. Make it quiet." Ballast tanks flood. The boat sinks. The deck angle shifts subtly under boots. Conversations stop. The only sounds are machinery and the ocean pressing closer. In the forward room, Santoro stares at the torpedo indicators like they personally betrayed him. He's thinking about all the hours spent loading these weapons, all the confidence the paperwork promised, all the men topside being bombed and shelled while submarines are supposed to be the knife in Japan's ribs. And right now, their knife is bending. A sonar ping blooms through the hull, bright, metallic, and accusatory. The escort is probing. Pierce stands in the conning tower, hands clenched behind his back. Jaw set so hard it aches. He doesn't speak his thought aloud, but everyone in that steel tube feels it. We did everything right. So why didn't they die? The sonar ping rolls through the hull again, clean, bright, and close enough to make fillings ache. "Range?" Pierce asks. In the sound room, radio man third class Eddie Harlow leans toward the headphones, eyes narrowed as if he can see through the bulkheads by listening hard enough. "Strong. Bearing 085. He's turning in." Pierce doesn't flinch. He's already picturing the destroyer above, a gray blade with a wake like ripped cloth, a deck crew hunched over rails, the sonar operator calling out bearings with the excitement of a man who thinks the prey is already dead. "Steady on course," Pierce orders. "All ahead 1/3. Keep her quiet." The electric motors hum low, smoother than diesel, but every rotating shaft is still a confession in the sea. The boat levels at 100 feet, and the pressure outside turns the hull into a tightening drum. Men move with careful steps, not from discipline alone, but from superstition. One dropped wrench can become a death sentence. A third ping. Closer. "Rig for depth charge," someone murmurs, and it travels down the passageway like a chill. Santoro grips a handrail in the forward compartment. The metal is cold and wet. His mind keeps replaying those impacts. 4 perfect approaches, 4 perfect solutions, 4 failures. If the weapons had worked, this boat would already be slipping away under cover of chaos, burning ship, screaming escort, confusion. Instead, the destroyer is hunting with a calm appetite. Pierce takes the periscope down? No, he's blind now. He has only sound, instinct, and geometry. He shifts his weight, listening to the subtle changes in the ship's voice, the faint creak of hull frames, the whisper of water along plating. When you've been under long enough, the ocean's pressure becomes a physical presence, like a hand on your spine. "Ping just went broad," Harlow says. "He overshot." Pierce's eyes flash. "Hard right rudder. 2/3 for 20 seconds. The helm answers. The submarine leans into a turn, slow and heavy, like a beast changing direction in mud. Men brace without speaking. The destroyer pings again, but now the sound is slightly off. Less centered. More searching. A predator that lost the scent for a moment. Then, the first depth charge. It doesn't explode near enough to kill them, but it's close enough to remind every man what killing feels like. The shockwave hits like a fist. Lights flicker. A shower of dust and rust flakes falls from overhead pipes. Somewhere aft, a gauge needle jumps and settles. The hull booms. An enormous hollow sound that seems too big to fit inside the steel. Santoro's teeth clack. He tastes copper. Another depth charge. Closer. Then another. Walking in a line as the destroyer guesses and adjusts. Pierce holds himself very still. He knows panic makes noise. Panic makes mistakes. Panic becomes bubbles, and bubbles become a widening ring on the surface that a Japanese lookout will point at with a gloved finger. "Easy, easy," he murmurs, and the boat slips deeper, one careful foot at a time. The barrage passes. The destroyer's screws fade to a distant churn. The pings thin out, then stop entirely, either satisfied it scared the Americans off or convinced the ocean swallowed them. In that moment of breathing room, the crew doesn't celebrate. They just exist again. Someone wipes a trembling hand on trousers. Someone else stares at a valve wheel like it might suddenly turn itself. Pierce finally speaks in a voice that is low, controlled, and dangerous. "We had 4 hits. No one answers at first. It's not a question. It's an accusation aimed at the universe. Malloy's face is ashen in the red light. "We had the angle. We had the range. Everything was clean." Santoro's voice comes from forward, roughened by salt and fury. "I heard him, sir. Solid contacts. No detonation." Pierce's eyes narrow. "Mark 6? Santoro nods once, hard. "Mark 6 exploders. Same ones we've been issued since before the war." Pierce looks away, jaw tight, because there's nowhere safe to put his anger inside a steel cylinder at sea. If he lets it out, it will poison morale. If he swallows it, it will eat him. Hours later, after the boat has slipped into deeper water and the immediate hunt has ended, Pierce comes up to periscope depth again. The ocean is calmer. The sky is still black, but now it's an emptiness with fewer teeth. He raises the periscope slowly. No destroyer, no merchant ship, nothing but long, indifferent water, The opportunity is gone. And that's the worst part. Worse than the depth charges. Worse than the pinging. The war doesn't pause to let you fix a mistake. It just keeps moving. And if your weapons don't work, you become a man swinging his fists in a dream. Days later, when the submarine finally noses back into port, exhausted, half stinking of oil and sweat, battery fumes, and boiled coffee, Pierce's crew shuffles down the pier with that particular gait of men who have lived too long in narrow steel. Shore smells too bright. The sun feels wrong on their faces. In the wardroom, paperwork waits like a verdict. Pierce sits at a table with a pencil that feels too small in his hand and begins writing the patrol report. He describes the convoy, the escort, the solutions, the firing, the impacts, the 4 failures. He chooses his words carefully because he has already learned how the system hears things. If you blame the torpedo, you're called emotional. If you blame the exploder, you're told it was tested. If you insist you had perfect setup, you're told no one has perfect setup in war. When the report is sent up the chain, it doesn't travel as a desperate cry from a man fighting underwater with faulty teeth. It becomes ink, a file, a paragraph, a problem to be reviewed later. And somewhere far from Mindoro Strait, far from the smell of bilge and fear, men in clean uniforms, in offices with polished floors and quiet telephones, read the words, "Torpedo failed to detonate," and feel something colder than anger. They feel disbelief, because the Bureau of Ordnance has already assured the fleet the Mark 14 is fine, the Mark 6 is advanced, the tests were conducted, the weapon is reliable. The skippers returning from patrol, men like Pierce, begin to compare notes in the half-shadows of submarine tenders and waterfront bars. They speak in low voices, not because it's secret, but because it's shameful to admit your punches aren't landing. "Ran under," one captain says, eyes bloodshot. "Watch the wake pass right beneath the target. Hit a nothing," another mutters, "like throwing a rock. I had one blow up early," a third says, "premature, out there in the water, lit up the whole ocean like a signal flare." The pattern is forming, slowly and horribly. Torpedoes that run too deep, torpedoes that refuse to explode, torpedoes that explode too soon. Each failure, a wasted chance. Each wasted chance, another freighter steaming safely toward Japan with fuel, food, ammunition, replacement parts, the lifeblood of an empire. And the Japanese, out there on the dark bridges of their merchant ships and escorts, begin to believe something else too. They begin to believe the American submarine threat is exaggerated. They begin to laugh. The laughter, real or imagined, follows Pierce back into the routine of war. It follows him into the next patrol briefing, into the next set of charts spread on the wardroom table, into the next time he watches sailors cradle a Mark 14 on the loading skids, like it's a sacred object instead of a suspect. By mid-1942, the whispers aren't whispers anymore. They're a low, constant growl running through submarine bases from Pearl Harbor to Fremantle. Skippers comparing scars, chiefs comparing notes, men who've stared through periscopes at perfect shots that turned into nothing. And then the growl reaches a man who doesn't tolerate mysteries that cost lives. Fremantle, Western Australia. The heat sits on the base like a wet hand. The air smells of salt, diesel, and sun-baked timber. Inside a cramped operations building, a ceiling fan chops the air without cooling it. Rear Admiral Charles A. Lockwood, broad-shouldered, blunt-faced, with the impatient eyes of a man who would rather be at sea than behind a desk, stands over a table littered with patrol reports. The pages are smudged with fingerprints and coffee rings, each one a small confession of failure. Across from him, a torpedo officer in sweat-darkened khakis tries to keep his voice neutral. "Sir, the Bureau insists the Mark 14 meets specifications." Lockwood's hand comes down on the paper with a slap. "Then the specifications are wrong." He points to a line in Pierce's report. "Hit, no detonation." Then to another. "Ran under." Then another. "Premature explosion." "This isn't one skipper missing his setup," Lockwood says, voice low enough that it forces the room to listen. "This is a weapon lying to us." Someone starts to offer a cautious objection. Testing takes time. Wartime supply. The proper channels. Lockwood cuts it off with a look. "We're done waiting for permission to stop bleeding." The next morning, the base feels different, like a decision has been made. Out on the water in a shallow test area, a work crew strings heavy netting, rope and mesh designed to catch a running torpedo without destroying it. Small craft idle nearby, their engines sputtering. Sailors lean over gunwales, squinting into the glare, while the sea slaps lazily at the floats holding the net in place. On the firing platform, Santoro is there. Not because anyone asked his opinion, but because Lockwood has learned to trust the men who load the weapons, not just the men who sign for them. Santoro runs his palm over the torpedo casing. It's warm from the sun. The depth-setting gear sits inside like a secret. "Depth set. 10 feet, the officer calls out. Santoro mutters, barely audible. 10 feet, like always." A whistle. A signal flag. The torpedo is launched. It vanishes into the water with that familiar kick, the surface briefly boiling, then smoothing. For a few seconds, there's nothing but the sound of small engines and gulls. Then a faint, pale line appears beneath the water, deeper than it should be. A sailor points. "There! It's under the net!" They all see it now. A ghostly cylinder sliding beneath the mesh instead of into it, running like a thief along the bottom edge. Lockwood's face hardens, as if something inside him has snapped into place. "Again," he says. They do it again, and again. Different torpedoes, different settings. Each time, the same ugly truth rises out of the glare. The Mark 14 is running deeper than its setting. On the dock afterward, the torpedoes are hauled back, dripping and gleaming, the bow. Men strip panels. They check the depth mechanism. They measure, recalibrate, argue over tiny tolerances that suddenly feel like life and death. Malloy stands nearby, watching with the grim focus of a man who has been told he missed, when he knows he didn't. "So we weren't crazy," he says quietly. Santoro's laugh has no humor. "Crazy would have been better. Crazy you can fix with sleep." Lockwood doesn't celebrate. He doesn't smile. He just issues the order that changes everything for the next patrols. Set the torpedoes shallower than the book says. Compensate for the lie. It's a crude fix, but it's a start. Like tightening a bandage on a wound you're finally willing to admit exists. But the ocean's not done humiliating them yet. Because even when the torpedoes begin to reach the correct depth, the next failure shows up wearing a different mask. Out at sea again, Pierce takes another shot weeks later, this time with the depth adjusted, the approach clean. He fires, watches, and a flash blooms too early. A torpedo detonating out in empty water, miles short of the target. The explosion lights the waves like a camera flash in the night, announcing the submarine's presence to every lookout with eyes. Premature. Back at base, Lockwood listens to the growing pile of these reports, and he can almost hear the weapon's mechanisms clicking inside the casing. Too clever, too delicate, too confident in physics that don't care about real seas. In the torpedo shop, under harsh lamps, an exploder sits on a workbench like a dissected animal. The Mark VI is supposed to sense a ship's magnetic field and detonate under the keel. The perfect kill. But the ocean isn't a laboratory. Latitude changes. Magnetic anomalies change. Sea states change. A torpedo porpoises slightly, a fraction too high or too low, and the exploder panics. Lockwood leans in, listening to the explanations, and then he makes another decision that doesn't require paperwork. "Turn off the magnetic feature," he orders. A lieutenant blinks. "Sir, the Bureau says—" "I don't care what they say," Lockwood snaps. "I care what's happening. If we have to hit the damned ship like a fist instead of a scalpel, then we hit it like a fist." So the submarines go back out with the magnetic exploder effectively neutered, relying on contact detonation. A simpler promise: strike the hull, explode. And for a moment, it seems like the nightmare is ending. Until the reports come back again. Hit. No detonation. Not a premature this time. Not a runner under. A clean contact that still refuses to become fire. In a cramped workshop, Santoro watches a technician demonstrate the failure with the cold calm of someone who's been embarrassed too often to feel surprised. The exploder's firing mechanism, meant to drive a pin into a detonator, can deform under the shock of impact, especially at an angle. Metal bends where it should. Bite. A part that should move sticks. "Under real conditions," the technician says, tapping the mechanism with a tool, "it can jam or it can crush." Santoro's fingers curl into a fist. "So the torpedo hits, and it just doesn't." Lockwood stands with arms crossed, staring at the pieces as if he can intimidate them into honesty. The room is silent except for the distant hammering of a shipyard and the dull whir of a fan. Finally, Lockwood speaks in a voice that feels like an order to the entire war. "Then we redesign it, strengthen it, whatever it takes." The fix doesn't happen in a single heroic moment. It happens in greasy hands and metal shavings. It happens in test shots and retrieved duds. It happens in men taking mechanisms apart and putting them back together with the stubbornness of people who refuse to be mocked by physics. And then, one night at sea, after the depth has been corrected and the magnetic feature silenced and the contact mechanism reinforced, Pierce lines up on another merchant ship. The periscope view is steady. The numbers are right. The crew is quiet in that deadly, practiced way. "Fire one," he says. The torpedo runs. It hits. And this time, the ocean doesn't answer with a thunk. It answers with a violent, blooming concussion, a deep underwater crack that punches the submarine's hull like a drumbeat of salvation. The merchant ship's silhouette jerks, then begins to sag. Flames crawl upward. Men appear on deck as frantic specks. The ship's bow starts to settle, slow at first, then faster, like a man realizing too late he's been shot. In the conning tower, Pierce closes his eyes for half a second, not in prayer, but in relief so sharp it almost hurts. Around him, no one cheers. Not loudly, not like surface sailors would. They just let out breath they didn't know they'd been holding for months, because the torpedoes have finally started telling the truth. The explosion's echo fades into the deep, like thunder sinking into sand. For a moment, the submarine feels lighter, less like a hunted thing and more like a weapon again. Pierce keeps his eye to the periscope as the merchant ship lists. Flames stitch across the deck, orange against the night, and the sea around her glitters with burning fuel. The escort destroyer swings hard toward the blast, its wake carving a white arc. "Down periscope," Pierce says, voice steady now, in a way it hasn't been for months. "Take her down. 150. Quiet." The boat sinks. The crew moves with a new confidence, still careful, still disciplined, but no longer haunted by the sense that their weapons are rolling dice behind their backs. In the torpedo room, Santoro rests his palm on the tube door as if it's a living thing that finally remembered what it was made to do. The destroyer's sonar pings return, furious now, sharp as shouted curses. Depth charges begin to walk the water, searching for the attacker, but the pattern has shifted. The Americans aren't just surviving anymore, they're scoring. And scoring changes how you endure. Pierce rides out the depth charges with the same quiet skill he always had, but now every shockwave has meaning. You're angry because we hurt you. That's a different kind of fear, a fear that belongs to the enemy. When the boat escapes and surfaces later, the air rushing down the hatch is cold and clean, like a blessing. Men climb up to breathe it, blinking at starlight. Somewhere in the distance, the horizon still glows faintly from the dying ship. No one jokes about American torpedoes tonight. And when Pierce's patrol ends, his report reads differently. It still has the terse Navy language, the clipped math of war, but the outcome is no longer a string of humiliations. It's tonnage, it's confirmed sinkings, it's shipping removed from the map. Word spreads the way it always does in war, faster than official communiques, carried by tired men on piers, by chiefs sharing cigarettes under dim lights, by officers in wardrooms tracing convoy routes with fingers and realizing the ocean is starting to belong to them again. By 1943, the U.S. submarine force becomes something Japan can't afford to dismiss. Not because submarines suddenly became braver. They had always been brave. But because the Mark 14, once corrected for depth and stripped of its treacherous magnetic temper, and once paired with a contact exploder that actually functioned, finally turned bravery into results. And those results arrive in Japanese ports as absence. A freighter that should have brought aviation fuel doesn't arrive. A cargo ship carrying spare parts for aircraft engines disappears. A tanker meant to refuel destroyers never makes it to the rendezvous point. At first, Japanese shipping companies treat it like bad luck. Storms, navigational error, bad seamanship. The Pacific is wide. Ships vanish in wide oceans. Then the losses accumulate, and even the most polite accounting clerks begin to understand what the Navy officers don't want to admit. This isn't weather. This is a knife. In Tokyo, the Imperial Japanese Navy's planning rooms are clean and bright. Maps hang on walls. Staff officers in crisp uniforms move pins across routes with gloved fingers. For months, they have been fighting a war of numbers. How much fuel? How many shells? How many tons of rice? In the early months, they counted American submarines as an irritation. Now, they count them as a hemorrhage. On a humid afternoon, a Japanese logistics officer, captain, supply service, leans over a chart showing shipping departures. His pencil pauses, hovering over empty columns where arrivals should be. He doesn't say the word aloud in front of everyone, but inside his head it forms anyway. Strangulation. Because a modern war machine doesn't run on courage alone. It runs on steel and oil and rubber and ammunition and food, all moving like blood through arteries of sea lanes. And submarines, quiet, patient, invisible, don't need to sink the battleship to win the war. They just need to stop the blood. In the Pacific, the American boats learn the rhythm of that blood. They learn where it flows thickest. They take positions off Japan's home islands, off Formosa, off the South China Sea routes, off choke points where shipping has no room to dodge. They prowl like wolves in a shipping lane that Japan cannot reroute without starving its own army. The crews adapt too. With working torpedoes, tactics get sharper, bolder. Skippers begin to close the range. Some take the risk of night surface attacks, using the submarine's silhouette as little as possible, trusting speed and darkness and surprise. Others stalk submerged in daylight, periscope barely breaking the surface, waiting for the precise moment when a target fills the lens like a wall. You can feel the change in the boat during an attack now. The tension is still there. Tension is part of the job, but it's cleaner, less bitter. Men don't flinch at the moment of impact. They wait for the explosion the way you wait for your own heartbeat. And it comes. A freighter's hull blossoms outward as if punched from inside. A tanker's deck erupts in a fountain of flame. A transport ship slows, lists, and dies with a long hiss of steam and shattering metal. Sometimes there are survivors in the water, tiny figures clinging to debris. Submariners watch through periscopes, faces unreadable. There's no celebration. There's only the hard knowledge that every ship sunk means fewer bullets fired at Marines on beaches, fewer planes fueled, fewer destroyers resupplied. It's arithmetic written in fire. Back at base, Lockwood reads the reports with a different kind of fury now, not the fury of betrayal, but the fury of opportunity. Every ton sunk is proof that the earlier months of failure weren't due to cowardice or incompetence. They were due to a weapon that lied. He doesn't forget that. He doesn't let anyone forget that. Because while submarines are now killing shipping at a devastating pace, the memory of those early patrols still stings like salt in a wound. The crews remember standing over a periscope, watching perfect shots become harmless thunks. They remember Japanese officers laughing. And in some quiet, private corner of many submariners' minds, the war becomes personal in a way it wasn't before. Not hatred, something colder. A determination to make the sea collect the debt. By late 1944 and into 1945, the cumulative effect is no longer subtle. Japan's merchant marine is bleeding out. Fuel shortages bite hard. Training flights are curtailed. Ships sit idle for lack of oil. Factories falter when raw materials can't arrive. The empire's far-flung garrisons, spread across islands and coasts, find themselves cut off, watching the horizon for ships that never come. An army can fight, hungry for a while. A navy can sail short on fuel for a while. An empire can improvise for a while. But for a while ends when the arteries are cut. And the men in the submarines, men like Pierce and Santoro and Malloy, know it in their bones when they return from patrols and see the tonnage boards climbing, the maps dotted with sinkings, the quiet respect in the eyes of officers who used to doubt them. It wasn't one dramatic battle that turned the tide for them. It was a fix, a brutal, stubborn correction of a deadly flaw. A moment when reality finally overruled pride and paperwork. Because once the Mark 14 and its exploder mechanisms were forced to tell the truth, U.S. submarines stopped being a threat Japan could mock, and became the shipping killers that made Japan's war effort slowly, inexorably, collapse under its own starving weight.